The most dangerous enemies are those who are not afraid to die. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a kamikaze pilot returned alive after his suicide mission? Kazuo Odachi is one of the last living members of a group that never intended to survive. He wants to remind Japan that before its modern success came the sacrifices of young pilots who gave their lives, for more than 6 decades, kept a secret. At the age of 17, he became a kamikaze pilot, one of thousands of young Japanese tasked with giving their lives in last-minute suicide missions near the end of World War II. In his book entitled Memoirs of a Kamikaze, he recalls that at the time, he asked himself the following question: what if a kamikaze pilot survived? Facing the powerful American military machine, the desperate Japanese sought a new way to fight the Americans, and thus emerged the legendary kamikaze pilots. The word kamikaze translates to divine wind, a reference to a legendary episode in Japanese history in which a typhoon saved Japan from Mongol invaders in 1281. Kamikaze aircraft were essentially explosive missiles guided by pilots, either purpose-built or converted from conventional aircraft. The pilots would attempt to crash their aircraft into enemy ships in what was called a body attack, using planes loaded with bombs, torpedoes, and/or other explosives. About 19% of kamikaze attacks were successful. The Japanese considered the goal of damaging or sinking a large number of Allied ships a just reason for suicide attacks. The kamikaze was more accurate than conventional attacks and generally caused more damage. Some kamikazes were still able to hit their targets even after their aircraft had been damaged. The attacks began in October 1944, at a time when the war seemed increasingly grim for the Japanese. They had lost several major battles, many of their best pilots had been killed, their aircraft were becoming obsolete, and they had lost control of the skies. Japan was losing pilots faster than it could train replacements, and the country's industrial capacity was falling behind that of the Allies. These factors, along with Japan's reluctance to surrender, led to the use of kamikaze tactics as Allied forces advanced toward the Japanese islands. However, the American military nicknamed them baka bombs, derived from the Japanese word baka, meaning idiot. This was because kamikaze planes were relatively easy to shoot down, as they flew directly toward American vessels. This defiant attitude baffled U.S. military leaders, who couldn't understand what could drive so many young Japanese to sacrifice their lives in such a spectacular and final way. Despite this, kamikaze attacks inflicted considerable damage on the U.S. and its allies. Approximately only 1 in every 5 kamikaze pilots managed to hit their targets, but even so, they sank 34 ships and damaged hundreds of others in the final years of the conflict. During the intense Battle of Okinawa, kamikaze pilots were responsible for the deaths of 5,000 U.S. Navy sailors, the highest number of casualties in a single battle in U.S. Navy history. According to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, from October 1944 to the end of the war, 2,550 kamikaze missions were carried out, with only 475, or 18.6%, resulting in a hit or damaging near miss. Warships of all types were damaged, including 12 aircraft carriers, 15 battleships, and 16 light and escort carriers. However, no ship larger than an escort carrier was sunk. Approximately 45 ships were sunk, most of them destroyers. For the United States, the losses were so concerning that more than 2,000 B-29 sorties were diverted from attacking Japanese cities and industries to attack kamikaze airfields in Kyushu. According to a page from the U.S. Air Force, approximately 2,800 kamikaze attackers sank 34 Navy ships, damaged another 368, killed 4,900 sailors, and wounded more than 4,800. Despite radar detection and signaling, aerial interception, attrition, and massive anti-aircraft barrages, 14% of kamikazes survived to strike a ship. Nearly 8.5% of all ships hit by kamikazes were sunk. Beyond the military impact, kamikaze tactics also served as an effective form of psychological warfare. Each kamikaze mission was essentially a suicide mission, and none of the thousands of kamikaze pilots who took off in the final phase of World War II expected to return alive from their missions. This fact was hard for the US and its allies to believe, as they couldn't fully understand how so many young Japanese were willing to take such drastic measures to defeat their enemies, living under the constant fear of the next desperate kamikaze attack. It was claimed by the Japanese forces at the time that there were many volunteers for the suicide forces. Captain Motoharu Okamura commented that there were so many volunteers for suicide missions that he referred to them as a swarm of bees, explaining, "Bees die after they sting." Okamura is considered the first to propose the kamikaze attacks. Captain Okamura expressed his ideas about forced dive tactics. "In our current situation, I firmly believe that the only way to turn the war in our favor is to resort to forced diving attacks with our aircraft. There is no other way. There will be more than enough volunteers for this chance to save our country, and I would like to command such an operation. Provide me with 300 aircraft, and I will turn the tide of the war." When the volunteers arrived to serve in the Corps, there were twice as many people as there were planes available. After the war, some commanders expressed regret for allowing surplus crew members to accompany the sorties, sometimes cramming into bombers and fighters to encourage the suicide pilots, and apparently to join in the exultation of sinking a large enemy ship. Many of the kamikaze pilots believed that their death would repay the debt they owed and demonstrate the love they had for their families, friends, and emperor. Many barely trained pilots were so eager to take part in suicide missions that when their missions were delayed or aborted, they were deeply disappointed. Many of those who were selected for a body crash mission were described as being extraordinarily happy immediately before their final sortie. Over time, modern critics have questioned the nationalist portrayal of kamikaze pilots as noble soldiers willing to sacrifice their lives for their country. In 2006, Tsuneo Watanabe, editor-in-chief of Yomiuri Shimbun, criticized Japanese nationalists' glorification of kamikaze attacks. "It's all a lie that they went out full of courage and joy shouting, 'Long live the emperor!' They were sheep to the slaughter. Everyone was looking down and staggering. Some couldn't even stand and were carried and pushed into their planes by maintenance soldiers." So, what happened when a kamikaze pilot survived? Growing up in a village near an air base, Odachi was always fascinated by airplanes, and when the war began, he decided that one day he would fly one. He enlisted in Japan's armed forces in 1943 and joined the Yokurin, an elite group of teenagers trained as Navy pilots. The Yokurin, Odachi pointed out, were different from other kamikaze, students who had been pulled from their schools and condemned to death with little preparation or training. Even so, the young men in Odachi's program were prepared to die in air combat even before Japan's desperate turn to suicide missions. The cadets were celebrated like cherry blossoms, a flower whose vivid beauty is accentuated by its brief existence. Even the buttons on their uniforms, embossed with the flower, served as a reminder of their imminent death in battle. "We all knew that happily ever after was an unlikely outcome," wrote Odachi in his book, Memories of a Kamikaze. "We were not meant to live long." When he arrived in Japanese-occupied Taiwan in August 1944, the war was entering its final stage. Japanese forces were being crushed by the technological superiority of the Americans and the overwhelming production capacity of the US war machine. An Allied victory seemed increasingly inevitable, and Japanese tactics began to demand even greater human sacrifice. In air combat, pilots were instructed to aim to cut the enemy with our own propellers, wrote Odachi. Of course, death was certain if this happened, but at least we would take the enemy with us. These tactics relied on the belief that Japanese aviators were more willing to die than their enemies. That belief was put to the test in October 1944, when the Japanese Navy decided to go all in to prevent an American attack on its forces in the Philippines during what would become known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japanese officers explained to Mr. Odachi and his cohort the plan to use suicide missions and asked for volunteers. They were met with stunned silence. Only when the officers began to harangue them did the first men reluctantly volunteer, he wrote. "We were essentially persuaded to commit suicide. On October 25th, Odachi witnessed the first successful sortie of suicide fighters taking off from a bombed-out runway in the Philippines. But Odachi and his comrades soon found themselves trapped on the island nation as American bombers destroyed many of the remaining planes in their squadron. Months later, he and others fled to Taiwan, where on April 4, 1945, he received the first assignment of his 10-month term as a suicide pilot. Odachi's Zero, the agile Japanese fighter that once reigned supreme in the skies of the Pacific in the early years of the war, was now fitted with a massive 500-kilogram bomb, making it nearly impossible to maneuver in front of the enemy. When American fighters spotted him, he dropped his bomb into the ocean and managed to escape. On his next sortie, his group couldn't find a target. The next 6 missions also ended in failure. After each attempt, he waited weeks for new orders. Every night, officers announced who would fly into battle the next day. It felt like a death sentence being handed out, and it was stomach-turning, he wrote. But in the end, he said, we became indifferent to questions of life and death. Our only concern was to make the final moment count. That moment, however, never came. On his final mission, his plane was preparing for takeoff when a ground crew member ran onto the runway, shouting and waving for the squadron to stop. Odachi learned that the emperor had just announced Japan's surrender. He was going home. On his return, as a train carried him through the bombed-out remains of Hiroshima, he fully understood that the war was over. At his home in Tokyo, he took the short ceremonial sword commemorating his status as a kamikaze and threw it into the fireplace, where it melted into a lump of steel. His only memories of the war are a handful of photos and a gift from a young woman he met in Taiwan. A silk handkerchief made from parachute fabric, embroidered with cherry blossoms and a blue anchor, the symbol of the Yokorin. Mr. Odachi never revealed the identity of the woman. It is one of the few things about the war he still refuses to talk about. People, he said, often commented that kamikaze didn't value their own lives. He hopes his memoir reminds them not only of the cost of conflict, but also of the humanity of the young men whose lives were sacrificed for it. We were the same age as today's high school students and college freshmen, he said. There wasn't a single one among us who would have chosen to die on their own. How did the Japanese manage to convince so many young men in the prime of their youth to voluntarily, and even enthusiastically, sacrifice themselves for their country in these suicide missions? In short, honor is an extremely important part of Japanese culture, and kamikaze training focused on reinforcing this ideology and convincing these young men that their sacrifice would bring them glory in the afterlife and honor to the families they left behind. Most believed that Emperor Hirohito and the nation of Japan were one and the same, and they were conditioned to be willing to die for him. They were trained to suppress all emotions and led to believe that they had been specially chosen for the sacrifice. A great honor in Japanese culture. In some cases, Emperor Hirohito himself visited the kamikaze training school, attending graduation ceremonies on a symbolic white horse. During training, the pilots practiced the bold maneuvers that would be required to complete their missions, repeatedly flying their planes nearly vertically toward the ground to simulate the impact on an enemy target before sharply changing direction before the crash. These exercises prepared them for the day when they would follow through with the descent and dive into certain death and glory. In the final stages of the war, the Japanese, in addition to facing a shortage of troops, used obsolete and damaged planes adapted for kamikaze missions. Although the kamikaze were trained to die, not all of them did. Those who returned were divided into 2 groups: those who were forced to abort their missions due to mechanical problems, adverse weather conditions, or inability to locate the targets, and those who were unable to carry out the mission due to fear. These 2 groups were treated very differently by their superiors. Those who could prove that they returned for reasons beyond their control were not punished, as Japan could not afford to lose pilots, so these kamikaze simply prepared to try again. Those who aborted their mission out of fear were shamed and punished physically and mentally. Still, the weakened Japanese could not afford to lose even these reluctant pilots, and the punishment was limited to ensure the pilot could make another attempt. Even under these extraordinary circumstances, Japanese military tolerance had its limits. Surviving kamikaze pilots recall the fate of a pilot who returned from a total of 9 final flights, being unable to fulfill his mission on every occasion. After the 9th attempt, he was finally executed for cowardice. To combat this natural tendency to back out at the last minute, the Japanese implemented several strategies to encourage pilots to proceed with their suicide missions. Pilots flew in squadrons in the hope that peer pressure would ensure they fulfilled their missions, and kamikaze were even given a certain amount of liquid courage before takeoff to help ease their doubts. It is said that the planes were fueled only enough for a one-way trip, ensuring there was no hope of return, and each pilot was required to compose a will and a letter to their families before the final flight. Despite all this, some kamikaze returned from their missions and survived to tell their stories. Thanks to them, we know that not all kamikaze were fanatics or unbalanced, but rather desperate and fearful of dishonoring their families if they survived a kamikaze mission. Current story of his returning to Odachi's case. While he built a family and a career as a Tokyo police officer, he kept his secret from practically everyone, even his wife, who only knew that he had served as a Navy pilot. The experience, he felt, would be too difficult to explain to a society that mainly viewed the kamikaze as maniacal fanatics who volunteered for an unthinkable sacrifice. But as the years passed and Japan's complex relationship with the war changed, Odachi gradually began to share his story with a small group of friends. In 2016, he published a memoir telling how he would fall asleep every night, wondering if tomorrow would be his turn to die for a lost cause. Odachi, now 93 years old, one of the last surviving members of a group that never intended to survive, said he hopes to honor the pilots as young men whose courage and patriotism were exploited. "I don't want anyone to forget that the wonderful country Japan has become today was built on the foundation of their deaths," he said in a recent interview at his home. The kamikaze are the most powerful symbol of war in Japan, a vivid example of the dangers of fervent nationalism and martial fanaticism. But as the generation that lived through the war disappears, opposing political sides in Japan are competing to reinterpret the kamikaze for an audience still divided over the legacy of the conflict. Nowadays, he receives visitors at his home in the suburbs of Tokyo, where he vividly reenacts old war scenes, stepping on imaginary aircraft pedals and fiercely pulling a fake flight stick. His story challenges the simplistic stereotypes often evoked by Japan's conservatives and liberals alike. He volunteered to fight in a war he believed his country would not win. He was prepared to die to protect those he loved, but not to throw his life away. Today, he is vehemently against war and believes that Japan's pacifist constitution is fine as it is, yet he remains a strong supporter of the country's right to self-defense. He has no regrets about his decision to enlist and visits the Yasukuni Shrine, where generations of Japan's war dead are enshrined alongside some of its most notorious war criminals, several times a year to comfort the souls of his friends who died in combat. Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.